The dining room at Ashwell Park held 32 that evening, and every one of them knew where Miss Cecily Vane had been placed. She sat 7 chairs below the gilded salt cellar, at the precise midpoint where the light from the silver candelabra faded into the unreliable glow of the side sconces. Above the salt, Lady Hartmore's diamonds caught the flame and scattered it in sharp, fleeting arcs across the tablecloth. Below it, the linen was quieter, the crystal plainer, the conversation the kind that faded when someone more interesting spoke above. Cecily had noted all of this with the practiced calm of a woman who had learned to count the exact cost of every room she entered. The cream gown she wore was her best, carefully pressed the morning she had left Northcote, but it was 4 years old, and the lace at the cuffs had been turned once. She was aware of this. She was aware, too, that Lady Constance Hartmore, seated in the hostess's chair at the table's far end, had looked at her twice since the company sat down, and that neither glance had been an oversight. What she was not aware of, and could not have been, was that the Duke of Ravenscroft had looked at her 7 times. She had noticed him when she arrived, as everyone did. He occupied the chair directly to Lord Hartmore's right, the position of highest honor, and he wore it the way he wore everything, Cecily supposed, with the absolute ease of a man who had never once needed to consider whether he belonged. His coat was dark blue, nearly black in the evening light, and his cravat was white as chalk. His face, when he was still, was the kind of face that did not invite approach. The jaw was set, the dark brows level, the gray eyes measuring something she could not see. He had spoken 3 sentences since the soup was removed, all of them to Lord Hartmore, all of them brief. He had not looked at her yet, or so she believed. She reached for the salt. It was a small gesture, unremarkable in itself, but it required her to lean forward slightly. And as she did, she caught the slight hesitation of the footman to her left. The young one, no older than 18, who had been watching her with an uncertainty that had nothing to do with his training. She had seen that look before. It meant he had been told something about the guest at that section of the table, and he was deciding whether the instruction he had received was correct. She smiled at him, small and direct. He recovered himself and passed the cellar without incident. She took what she needed, replaced it, and returned her gaze to her plate. If any cruelty in this world is designed to be observed without acknowledgement, it is the placement of a guest below the salt. The host and hostess say nothing. The other guests say nothing. The affected party is expected to say nothing most of all. The cut is perfect precisely because it requires no words. It is carried out through arithmetic alone, through the careful, deliberate subtraction of a name from the portion of the table that matters, and the notation of that subtraction in every face that watches and understands. Lady Hartmore understood this very well. She had refined it over 30 years of hosting. This evening was the autumn gathering at Ashwell Park. The 3rd week of October, and the close of the house party season, and Lady Hartmore had assembled her guests with her usual precision. There was the Earl of Belwick and his daughter Frederica, 19 and very fair, the season's new favorite, already spoken of in connection with the Duke's name in 3 separate drawing rooms that Cecily knew of. There was old Sir Marcus Pell and his wife. There was young Mr. Vickers, who had money and no title, and laughed too readily at everything. There were the Ashford cousins from Surrey, and Colonel Bryce, recently returned from the peninsula, and the Mrs. Pelham, who always came together and always sat very straight. And there was Cecily Vane. She had been invited, and she had understood on receipt of the letter that it was a favor of a qualified kind. Her father, Mr. Arthur Vane, had been a gentleman scholar of some standing in the county, a friend to Lord Hartmore for 30 years, and her own standing had been, until recently, a comfortable middling thing, respected without being conspicuous. Then her father had died in the spring, and the modest property at Northcote had passed to a distant cousin under the terms of the entail, and Cecily had found herself at 23, the possessor of a good education, a competent French, a not inconsiderable knowledge of classical literature, and £300 per year from a trust her father had settled before his death. It was enough to live on quietly. It was not enough to live on in the world, as it had been arranged. The invitation to Ashwell Park had come from Lady Hartmore, who had known her father, and Cecily had accepted it with the measured gratitude of a woman who did not delude herself about what it was. She had been offered a week's comfort at a fine house and the opportunity to be seen by useful people. She had understood from the first moment that she would be weighed in the balance the entire time, and she had packed her best gown and her father's small leather journal of Italian poetry, his parting gift, and she had come. She had not anticipated being placed below the salt. That was new. She had been here 4 days before the dinner, and in those 4 days she had been present and quiet and careful, had listened more than she spoke, had offered a judgment on a piece of music when asked and been told it was an interesting one, had spent the morning hours in the library reading, and had won the thorough approval of Lady Hartmore's spaniel, who had attached himself to her boot-hem on the second day, and not entirely relinquished his claim since. She had done nothing to earn the placement. She knew that. The placement was not about what she had done. It was about what she could no longer offer. The footman refilled the wine at her right, and she thanked him by name, which was Thomas, because she had learned all their names in the first 2 days. He blinked. Guests generally did not do that. "You are kind to him," said a voice. It came from 3 seats above her, from a woman she had not yet formally met, though she had seen her from a distance. Mrs. Adelaide Gresham was perhaps 50, a widow, with a dry and careful face, and the kind of clothes that said she had once had more money than she currently did, and had accepted the reduction with dignity. She had been watching Cecily since the soup, Cecily realized, but not with the particular assessment of Lady Hartmore's circle. "He is new," Cecily said. "He is nervous. A name helps." Mrs. Gresham looked at her steadily. "So it does," she said. It was not an invitation to further speech, but it was something. Cecily returned to her plate. The evening moved through its courses with the formal patience of a well-run house. The conversation at the upper end was bright with names Cecily recognized and opinions she could not contribute to without appearing to seek inclusion she had not been offered. She stayed within the modest compass of the exchange at her end, and was content to stay. She was not performing contentment. She was actually content, or as near to it as £300 a year, and the memory of her father's house could manufacture on an October evening in a room lit beautifully by candles she had not paid for. What she could not manage, entirely, was to stop being aware of the upper end of the table, not because of the diamonds, or the laughter, or Frederica of Belwick in her pale rose gown arranging herself with the alert, unconscious grace of a woman who had been told since childhood that arrangement was her purpose. All of that was easy to observe and set aside. It was the Duke of Ravenscroft she could not stop noticing, and she disliked herself for it with a quiet thoroughness that was entirely in keeping with her general approach to things she could not change. He had spoken no more than a dozen words since she last counted. He ate methodically, listened carefully, and when something was said directly to him, responded with the brief level sentences of a man who had decided long ago that volume was unnecessary. She could not hear what he said from this distance. She could see only the quality of his attention. It was, she thought, a very particular quality. Not boredom exactly, though he was not animated. not disapproval. Though there was no warmth visible, it was more as though he were watching something that had not yet arrived at its conclusion, and he was prepared to wait. His gaze crossed hers once, quickly, over the length of the table, and she looked away. The meal concluded. The ladies withdrew. The drawing room at Ashwell Park was hung with pale gold silk, and Lady Hartmore arranged her guests within it with the same quiet deliberation she applied to her dining room, which was to say that the more useful women were drawn toward the warmth of the fire and the better chairs near the window. And Cecily settled at the piano because she had been invited to play. And the piano was an activity that required nothing of the surrounding social topography. She played well. She knew she played well, not as a point of pride, but as a plain fact her father had confirmed through years of patient attention. She played a Clementi sonata that she had memorized at 16 and never quite forgotten. And then a quieter piece, an air she had arranged herself from one of the Italian folk melodies in her father's journal, and the room stilled for it in a way that she noticed only in her peripheral vision. Because she was looking at the keys, Miss Frederica Belwick was watching her. Miss Belwick's expression was the specific expression of a very young woman who had expected to be the most accomplished person in a room, and had discovered, partway through the evening, that the arithmetic was not working out as anticipated. Lady Hartmore had no such concerns. She glided to Cecily's side when the music concluded and said, in a voice pitched just above the adjacent conversation, "Your father was musical, as I recall. It seems he passed something along." It was gracious in form and dismissive in substance. Cecily recognized the construction. "He was," she said. "I am grateful for it." She did not reach for more. She folded her hands in her lap. When the gentleman rejoined the company, she was still at the piano, having been gently displaced from it by Miss Belwick, who sat down with a confidence that suggested she had been waiting for the opening. The music was fine, technically careful, and Cecily stood slightly apart from the room's main groupings with a cup of tea she was not drinking, and looked at the fire, and thought about the next morning, when she had promised herself she would finish the third canto of Tasso in the library, and the week after, when she would take the mail coach back to the small lodging rooms in Harrogate that were currently everything she owned in the world. Miss Vane. She did not startle. She had heard his approach, or rather she had heard the room shift around his approach, the particular redistribution of social weight that attended a man of his rank moving through a gathering. She turned. The Duke of Ravenscroft stood at a distance that was correct by every standard of propriety, and he was looking at her with the same measuring quality she had noted at dinner. His face at close range was not what she had expected. It was not handsome in the easy, fair-featured way of the portraits in the galleries at houses like this one. It was something harder than that, more specific. There was a faint line between the brows that suggested chronic thought or chronic grief or both. The gray eyes were, she decided, the color of winter river water. "Your Grace," she said. "You play well," he said. She waited. "Miss Belwick is technically proficient," he continued, and she heard the slight emphasis on the word technically as though he had placed it there with care, and then stood back to observe its effect. It is not the same thing. She was not certain what to do with that. She said, "Miss Belwick is very accomplished." "She is," he agreed, "as is the arrangement in her hair. Both are the result of the same considerable effort." She looked at him. He was not smiling, but there was something in the set of his mouth that was almost not neutral, a quality that vanished as soon as she thought she had seen it. "You are describing work made invisible," she said. "There is no unkindness in that." He studied her for a moment. "No," he said. "There is not." He asked after her journey, and after the Harrogate lodgings, which told her he had made some inquiry, and she answered both without volunteering more than he had asked for. When the conversation reached a natural close, he said, "The Italian air. Was it your own composition?" "An arrangement," she said, "from a folk melody my father collected." "He had good taste." "He did." A pause, which he did not fill. Then, "I am sorry for your loss, Miss Vane." It was said plainly, without ceremony, and she felt it land in the way that plain things sometimes did, when ornament would have softened them into nothing. "Thank you," she said. He moved on. He was, she noted, entirely composed. She was, she also noted, not. She set her cup down on the nearest table and did not pick it up again for the remainder of the evening. The house party had 3 days remaining after the dinner. She spent them as she had spent the days before, with the careful management of her own visibility, which was to say she was present where presence was expected, pleasant where pleasantness was invited, and invisible everywhere else. She was not precisely unhappy. The library at Ashwell Park was one of the finest she had ever used, and she had spent long portions of the morning there, and the spaniel had resumed his position at her feet. And on the second afternoon she had been given a commission by Mrs. Gresham, who had noticed that she wrote a good hand, and asked her to help address a quantity of correspondence that had been accumulating, and she had done it with genuine satisfaction, because the work was real, and it was hers, and it left no residue of obligation. The Duke had not sought her out again after the drawing-room encounter, and she had not expected him to. Men of his station spoke to women like her out of courtesy or curiosity, and both were typically exhausted in a single exchange. She had catalogued the conversation in the section of her mind reserved for pleasant things that would not recur, beside the memory of the ash tree in her father's garden and the smell of the library at Northcote in winter. On the third morning after the dinner, she was in the library when she heard a child crying. Not dramatic weeping, not the particular sound of injury or fear, but the quiet, persistent sound of a small person who had been distressed for some time and had begun to lose hope of anyone noticing. She set down her book and followed it. She found the child in the corridor outside the library, a boy of perhaps 6 or 7, sitting with his back to the wainscoting and his knees drawn up and his face turned down. He wore good clothes, dark blue, and his shoes were very clean. She sat down on the bench across from him. He looked up. "I do not know where the nursery is," he said. "I came down for my book, and now I cannot find the stairs again." "The east stairs?" she said. "Or the back passage through the green room?" "I do not know which those are either," he said. "Then I will show you," she said. "What is your name?" "Edmund," he said. "Edmund Calvert." She registered the name and what it meant, and kept her face still. "Well, Edmund," she said, "I know where both staircases are, and I will take you to whichever one you prefer, and if neither seems correct, we will find a footman who knows a third." He got to his feet with the residual dignity of a small boy who had been crying and did not want to have been crying, and she did not comment on the redness around his eyes. And they walked together through the corridor, and she showed him the east stair. And he said, "Thank you, miss," and went up. And she returned to the library. What she did not know, standing in the corridor watching Edmund's small heels disappear up the stairs, was that the Duke of Ravenscroft was at the end of the passage. He had been looking for Edmund for 40 minutes. He had been, she later understood, in a state of controlled and furious worry for those 40 minutes. The kind of worry that a man who never showed alarm absorbed entirely into stillness and silence, so that only the speed of his stride betrayed it. He had come around the corner from the long gallery just in time to see his nephew receive the information about the east stair, and set off up it with recovered composure. He stood at the end of the passage. She stood at the library door. She said, "He was not distressed, Your Grace. Only misplaced." He looked at her for a long moment, and she thought she saw something happen in the gray eyes. A very brief and very complete change, as though the winter river had broken suddenly at its surface. And then it was covered again. And he said, "Thank you," in a voice that was too quiet to be merely formal. She nodded and went back into the library. And after a moment she heard his footsteps go toward the east stair. Unhurried now, as though he had been told something he needed to be told, and could now resume his ordinary pace. It was from this exchange, she decided later, that things became complicated. The last evening of the house party was a small dinner, followed by dancing in the Hartmore ballroom, a room of pale marble columns and a floor polished to the quality of still water, lit by 200 candles and hung with late autumn flowers brought in from the succession houses. Lady Hartmore had arranged the seating for the dinner with her usual precision, and Cecily's place, again, was below the salt. This time, the footman did not hesitate. His name was Thomas, and he had learned her name on the first day. Cecily sat and looked at the candles and thought about the mail coach on Thursday morning. She had been watching her own composure for 4 days with the attentive care of a woman who knows that composure, like a garment worn in uncertain weather, may be very fine and still have its limit. She had reached, she thought, somewhere near it. Not because of the placement, not precisely. She had lived inside these arrangements long enough to know their mechanics. It was something else, something that had to do with the library, with the east stair, with the brief unguarded quality in the Duke's gray eyes that she had no business remembering as clearly as she did. The dinner passed. The company moved through to the ballroom. Lady Hartmore had opened the evening's dancing by placing Frederica of Belwick directly in the Duke's path at the room's entrance, a maneuver of such graceful engineering that it could only have been rehearsed. Miss Belwick was radiant in white muslin, her fair hair dressed with a single rope of pearls, and she offered her hand to the Duke with the practiced ease of a woman who had been told she would do it and had prepared herself accordingly. The Duke received the hand, led her to the floor, and danced with the same efficient competence he appeared to bring to every social obligation. Cecily watched from the edge of the room, beside the column nearest the door to the terrace, and told herself she was watching nothing in particular. Which was a lie. She managed for approximately 8 minutes. Then Lady Hartmore appeared at her shoulder. "You are very quiet this evening, Miss Vane," she said. The voice was pleasant. The quality of it carried. "I have enjoyed the evening," Cecily said. "I am glad to hear it. I had wondered whether you found yourself comfortable." The slight pause between comfortable and the rest of the sentence was perfectly placed. "My husband was very fond of your father, as you know. It seemed right to include you in the party. I hope it has not been a disappointment." "It has been a great pleasure," Cecily said. "Ashwell Park is very beautiful." "It is," Lady Hartmore agreed. "It is the sort of house that wants the right people in it." Another pause. "Your lodgings in Harrogate, I believe you mentioned. Are they comfortable?" "Quite comfortable, thank you. I only ask because one worries, with girls in reduced circumstances, whether they are managing sensibly." The word "girls" was placed like a pin through linen, precise and final. "Your father, God rest him, was not a practical man. Charming, very charming, but not practical. I hope you have had better guidance on matters of economy." Cecily looked at the candles. "I have my father's good sense," she said carefully. "And his example." Lady Hartmore smiled. "Of course," she said. She looked toward the floor, where the Duke was completing the set with Miss Belwick. "Ravenscroft will marry this season. Everyone says so." Frederica would suit him beautifully. The right family, the right fortune, the right temperament for a man who needs a steady house. She turned the smile back to Cecily, with a warmth that did not reach the calculation behind it. That is what a man in his position needs after all. Steadiness. Not distraction. It was not subtle. It was not meant to be. It was the dismissive label given its sharpest form, voiced directly, in this ballroom, in this company, by the woman whose opinion organized the room. Cecily looked at her with an evenness that cost her something. "I expect you are right," she said. Lady Hartmore nodded and moved away toward the upper groupings, trailing satisfaction. If the exchange had been witnessed, Cecily did not know by whom. She turned toward the terrace doors and thought very carefully about the mail coach on Thursday morning, and the lodgings in Harrogate, and her father's journal, which was at this moment in her room upstairs, and which was the most reliable thing she owned. She did not hear the Duke approach. She heard the room shift. And then he was at her side. And he was standing not with the polite distance of earlier in the week, but close enough that she could see the faint tension at his jaw that she was beginning to recognize as the thing his face did, instead of expression. "You were placed below the salt at both dinners," he said. He said it the way he said most things, level, not quiet exactly, but without volume for the sake of volume. "I was," she said. "You said nothing." There was nothing to say. He looked at her. There was a great deal to say. She turned to look at him, because she could not do otherwise, and found the gray eyes very close and very direct. "Perhaps," she said. "A great deal that would have served no one." He stood with the particular stillness she had observed all week, and she waited for what came after it. And nothing came. And she thought he was going to say something that would constitute advice. Something kind and useless, something in the vein of men who meant well and understood nothing. She braced herself for it. "Walk with me," he said. She looked at him. "Onto the terrace," he said. "There is a frost. We will not stay long. Walk with me." She went. The terrace at Ashwell Park faced east across the park, and the October frost had come in just after dark, silvering the grass and quieting the sound of the night. The light from the ballroom fell in warm rectangles across the stone balustrade, and beyond it the dark was soft and cold and thorough. Cecily stood at the railing with her hands folded and her breath visible in the air, and waited for him to explain what he was doing. He stood beside her. He looked at the dark. "Edmund told me about the stair," he said. "He was very composed about it afterward," she said. "He was not composed for the 40 minutes before." "He was perfectly composed with me," she said, and felt rather than saw the slight shift in his posture. "He said you sat down across from him," he said. "On the bench. Rather than standing over him." "He was small," she said. "Standing over people is not especially useful when they are already distressed." The frost settled between them for a moment. "His mother died in January," the Duke said. "My sister, Margaret. She was 28 years old, and she had been ill for 7 months, and Edmund was with her most of those months, and he is, as a result, somewhat more fragile than he appears." He said it in the past tense, in the past perfect, with the flat precision of a man who had said the words often enough that they had ceased to carry him away. Though she could hear, under the precision, the quality of a grief that had been thorough and was still present. "I am sorry," she said. "She would have liked you," he said. "She had very little patience for the kind of room we have been in all evening." Cecily looked at the dark park and the frost on the grass, and did not trust herself to respond to that immediately. "She sounds like someone worth knowing," she said at last. She was, he said. They stood for a moment longer. I should return, she said. Lady Hartmore will have noted my absence. Lady Hartmore, he said, has been noting your presence all week and doing something counterproductive with the information. She did not say anything. He had said it very quietly, and there was no anger in it, which somehow made it more precise. Thursday, he said. You said the mail coach. She looked at him. Yes. In the morning. He looked at her for a long moment, and she thought again of the Winter River, and the surface of it, and what lay under. Come back inside, he said. She went. The ballroom was at its height when they re-entered, the candles burning lower and the music quicker, and the company had redistributed itself in the natural ways of an evening nearing its end. Lady Hartmore was at the far end of the room with the Countess of Belwick, deep in a conversation that had the compact, pleased quality of a plan in its final stages. Miss Belwick was dancing again, with the Earl of Belwick's young cousin, and she was very beautiful and very assured and entirely absorbed in her own proper world. Cecily moved to return to her place near the column by the terrace door. She heard the music change. She felt, before she understood it, a shift in the room's attention, a small, comprehensive redirection of faces, the kind that happened when something occurred that had not been scheduled. She turned. The Duke of Ravenscroft was crossing the ballroom floor. He was crossing it directly, without circling, without the polite diagonal navigation of a man who wished not to be observed making progress. He walked the way he did everything, with the absolute ease of a man who had never once needed to consider whether he belonged, and he was walking toward her. 32 people noted it. She counted them later, in the quiet, and she was close. He stopped in front of her. His face was, as it had been all week, composed. She could see the line between the brows, the level gray eyes. She could see, just at the jaw, the slight tension that she now understood was the thing his face did when he felt something. He held out his hand. She looked at it. "This set," he said. His voice was level. It was entirely audible. She heard Lady Hartmore's conversation stop. She heard, somewhere in the room, an intake of breath that was not hers. She put her hand in his. He did not look away from her. The room did not matter to him. She understood. The room was present. Witnesses were present. Lady Hartmore was very much present. And none of it altered the quality of his attention, which was the same quality she had seen all week. The measuring, patient quality of a man watching something that had not yet reached its conclusion. He led her to the floor. The music was a slow waltz, and the dance required, by its nature, a proximity that was not possible in country figures or cotillions, a proximity that was noted, that was observed from every point in the room, that could not be misread for convenience or courtesy. It was the proximity of a man choosing. She put her hand on his shoulder and felt the wool of his coat under her glove, and concentrated very carefully on the steps. "You dance well," he said, close to her ear. "My father was a good teacher," she said. Was he? He believed there was no social situation that a knowledge of Tasso and a willingness to be present could not improve. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. It was not a smile, precisely, or not yet, but it was a country a smile might eventually come from. He was probably correct, he said. They turned at the end of the room, and she caught, in her peripheral vision, Lady Hartmore's face. The calculation was still there. She could see the shape of it. But it was reconfiguring now around the new information, and the confidence that had framed it all week was, for the first time, not entirely intact. Frederica of Belwick was watching from the side of the room, and her expression was the expression of a woman who had been told a thing would happen in a particular way and was discovering that the world had other arrangements. Cecily returned her gaze to the Duke's lapel. "Your nephew," she said. "Edmund, will he stay at Ashwell Park?" "He goes with me," he said. "He has been with me since January." "He is fortunate," she said. "In the company, I mean." Another pause in which the music moved and the room watched, and she concentrated on her breathing. "Cecily," he said. She looked up. It was the first time he had used her given name. He said it with the same level quietness he used for everything, but it was different in kind from the ordinary level quietness, and she felt it differently. In the throat. In the place under the sternum where things that mattered sometimes landed. "I intend to call on you in Harrogate," he said, "after Thursday, if you will allow it." She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the waltz continued. "That is your intention," she said. Her voice was steady. She was pleased with it. "It is," he said. "I would also like to know, before you answer, that I am aware that the circumstances this week have been unworthy of you, and that I am aware of the specific agency that produced them." She thought of Lady Hartmoor's voice. Girls in reduced circumstances, not practical. Distraction. Lady Hartmoor, she said, believed she was protecting something useful. She was mistaken, he said. She was not mistaken in thinking I have nothing to offer that the season values. Then the season, he said, has been measuring the wrong things. The music began its final turn. Around them, 32 people were watching with the held, collective attention of a room that had understood something was happening and was waiting to understand what it meant. He stopped. The waltz was not yet fully concluded, but he stopped in the middle of the floor and turned to face her squarely and said, with his voice carrying clearly across the momentary silence of a room that had, without planning to, gone quiet, "Miss Vane is my guest for the remainder of this evening." It was 11 words. 12, perhaps. Lady Hartmoor's fan stilled in her hand. Miss Belwick looked down at her slippers. Mrs. Gresham, at the edge of the room, closed her eyes for a moment, the way people did when something they had hoped for had arrived. Cecily looked at him. His face was composed, the jaw set, the gray eyes level, the line between the brows present. He was entirely himself. He was, she thought, possibly the most exactly himself that he had been all week. And what she had seen across this week, she understood now, was a person who was very rarely fully visible. She was looking at him being fully visible. "Thank you," she said quietly. Just the 2 words and nothing else. And he heard everything she meant by them. She could see that he did. They completed the final measure together. He did not leave her side for the remainder of the evening. He stood with her at the edge of the room, and he spoke to her as the company gradually redistributed itself around the new information of his choice, and people who had not sought her out all week found reasons to stop and speak, and she received them with the quiet grace she had been practicing all her life without knowing she was practicing it for this. Lady Hartmoor did not approach again that evening. When the company dispersed toward the candlelit stairs, he said, "Good evening, Cecily." And she said, "Good evening, Your Grace." And he said, his voice carrying the same quality as the winter river at the moment before it breaks, "In Harrogate, it will be Julian." She went upstairs with her hands folded and her heart doing the only thing it could do. Thursday came, and the mail coach came with it, and she sat in it with her father's journal on her knee and the frost still on the fields outside the window, and she did not try to make her face do anything in particular, which was a luxury she had not had all week and was grateful for now. He had called on her 3 weeks later in Harrogate. He had come in a traveling carriage with Edmund and a small spaniel that Edmund had named after a classical figure she recognized, incorrectly, from her father's Italian poetry, and she had not corrected the name because the dog seemed to have taken to it. And she and Julian had sat in her small parlor while Edmund investigated the window seat. And the fire had been adequate, and the tea had been good. And she had watched him in the plain light of an ordinary afternoon, and thought that this was what he looked like outside the arrangements of other people's houses. He looked like himself. He asked after the Tasso and the £300 a year and the Italian folk melodies, and she answered without dissembling, and he listened with the particular quality of attention she had come to recognize as his most genuine expression. And then he said, with a directness that she had by then stopped being surprised by, "I would like to propose a different arrangement for the £300. She looked at him. "It would involve a change of name," he said, "among other alterations." She looked at the fire. She looked at Edmund, who was examining a crack in the window seat frame with the grave thoroughness of a child who had found something worth understanding. She looked at Julian. "That is a considerable alteration," she said. "It is," he agreed. "I am aware of the magnitude. I am also aware that you are not a woman who does things for insufficient reason, and I would ask you not to refuse for insufficient reason either." She thought about the dinner table at Ashwell Park, and the salt cellar, and the cream gown with the turned lace cuffs, and the quality of the candlelight below the midpoint. She thought about the east stair, and Edmund's composure on the bench, and the frost on the terrace, and the moment in the middle of the waltz when 32 people had gone quiet. She thought about her father's journal, still on the table at her elbow, still open at the third canto. "My father would have liked you," she said. The thing that happened at the corner of Julian's mouth this time was unmistakably a smile. It arrived slowly, and with the quality of something that had not had much recent practice. And it was, she thought, the most complete thing she had seen all autumn. "I hope so," he said. She reached across and set her hand on his. He turned his hand over and held it, in the plain afternoon light of the small parlor, with Edmund occupied by the window seat, and the fire warm and her father's journal open on the table. And she stayed very still, and let the thing she felt be what it was. The spaniel had fallen asleep at her feet. It was her father's dog, in a way, she thought. Comfort coming home to the right hearth. By Christmas, the announcement had appeared in 3 county papers, and the Dowager Duchess Ravenscroft, who had written 3 letters against the match and received 3 patient and precise replies from her son, had come to visit and had sat with Cecily over embroidery for an afternoon, and by the end of it had said nothing unkind, which was not nothing. By the following spring, they were at Calvert House, which was Julian's primary estate, in the part of the country where the hills were gentle and the afternoons long, and Edmund had a schoolroom and a pony, and had learned the names of every footman in residence, a habit he said had been given to him by someone whose judgment he trusted, and the fire in the study was always lit, and her father's journal lived on the shelf between the Tasso and the Italian dictionary, between all the things that had been given to her and the things she had made from them. She was not below the salt here. She sat at her own table at the end of it, and Julian sat at the other end, and the candles burned where they were placed, and the light was equal along its entire length. If you have sat with this story tonight, leave a word for Cecily in the quiet, and come back to the next one. She looked at the fire, in the evening, in the house that was hers. The journal was open, as it always was, to the third canto. It stayed open.